Hi, I'm Ben, and welcome to the first ever episode of Subject Access, a new podcast where I speak to experts and explore how privacy, data, and AI law play out in practice, and also what it means for people who are building programs within businesses. Today, we're going to be asking the question, is privacy about to die? And with my guests' help, we will aim to understand whether privacy is and remains a meaningful concept and what implications and tensions agentic AI might have for privacy in the future. So, who's joining me today? Today I'm going to be speaking to Emma. Emma is a partner in the data, privacy, and cybersecurity team at TLT. She has a specialism in working with digital businesses and financial services across data and AI regulation. Over to you, Emma. It'd be great to just hear a little bit
Great.
about your experience and what you're interested in the world of privacy and AI.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ben. And thanks so much for having me on. I'm so excited to be your first guest. This is a
Yeah,
great honor. I'm really looking forward to our conversation as well. You did a lot of the heavy lifting for me in terms of introducing me. So, as you said, I'm a partner at TLT. I've been at TLT my entire career. So, I trained here and qualified here and made partner here earlier this year. So my background historically has been data protection, all things data. As with many data protection lawyers over the last few years, that practice has kind of evolved now to include AI as well. But I think, I have been and we have been as a firm thinking about AI for a long time. I think I did my first public speaking on AI in January 2018, so a long, long time ago, where I spoke at the O2 about the sort of intersection of AI and privacy. So it's been a huge area of interest for me for a long time, AI, and I think this question and around the sort of the inherent concept of privacy and whether that's something that is still meaningful in the sort of digitized world that we have today, I think is such an interesting question and a really great starting point for the podcast. So yeah, really excited to dive into it.
it's really cool to have you here and hear more about your thoughts on these things. Well, should we jump in?
Let's go for it. Yeah.
So, I've titled the episode "Is Privacy About to Die?" But what I wanted to ask was, starting off, is privacy already dead? And perhaps we can take a couple of examples here. So, starting with consumers, often we hear a lot about people saying that they value their privacy, and we have this kind of tension almost, the privacy paradox, where the daily behavior says one thing, they post on social media, use free services a lot. There's this kind of view that people don't care about privacy. And in addition to that, there's also this dynamic of public outrage for big breaches and surveillance scandals. But yeah, ultimately, we're seeing privacy rights or people giving up their privacy in exchange for products and convenience. So I guess where I'd like to start is to understand whether you think this is something that will continue, this kind of paradox here, or is this going to change, or is it a norm for the future?
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an interesting question and there's so much. I mean, we could fill probably an hour talking about just this this question, I think. So try not to get too kind of carried away with it. One thing that was really interesting in what you just said that I'm going to actually sort of slightly challenge if you don't mind is
Yeah, please.
you talked about people kind of giving up their privacy in exchange for services. And I think there is a big difference between giving up data and giving up privacy. I'm not saying that every organization gets that balance right, but just because you're giving over your data and just because an organization is handling your data and processing your data, to me that doesn't necessarily say you are giving up your privacy or giving up your data. You're handing your data over to an organization, they are processing that data, but obviously the frameworks are there to make sure that they do that right. The frameworks aren't there to stop people from doing that and to stop organizations from handling data. It's a small kind of sort of nuanced point, but it was just an interesting phrasing that kind of stood out to me as you were talking. So to come back to the kind of question as to is this something that is kind of going to be the norm? I find this absolutely fascinating. And it really reminds me of a lot of conversations that we had around the time that open banking sort of first came to the forefront, which is this, for anybody who doesn't know, this sort of framework within the financial services sector for governing data sharing between financial services organizations, all with customer consent, not GDPR level consent, hesitate to add, but all very much controlled by customers. And the idea being that it would kind of open up competition in the banking market and all of this. And open banking is something that has real benefits for individuals potentially. It really kind of expands the pool of financial services organizations that they can do business with. It makes it much easier to sort of switch providers, things like that. Lots and lots of benefits, but the uptake of it really at the time was very small. It kind of didn't take off in the way that I think the industry perhaps thought it might. And a lot of what that came down to was kind of what people saw as the sort of value exchange and the kind of, this idea that they were having to consent to their data being shared and going to new places, and they couldn't quite see what they were getting back from that. And I think it's a really interesting comparison between that, where there was something that was potentially very, very beneficial for people, but they still were reticent to share their data, versus social media, where there are benefits perhaps in terms of the connections that you get and things like that. But, people are giving over a lot more data and arguably losing more control over that data in that kind of context than they were in the open banking context. And yet they seem, as you say, to be much happier about doing that and much more willing to do that, which I think perhaps just speaks to the kind of the something perhaps in kind of the messaging that people are getting in those two different circumstances about the benefits that they get from doing that.
Do you think I think the privacy and data point you made, the challenge, I think is an absolutely really good one. Do you think there's something here, again, with open banking, social media, around the fact that actually there's something more desirable about one of these? You mentioned the benefits, but actually what people see as desirable, I think, free use of LLMs, for example, that is a thing that is very desirable for a lot of people, in the sense it's the new buzzy thing, and people are willing to put information, to have kind of quite sensitive or private chats with them. And I completely take the point on they're giving over their data. They're not necessarily saying, I don't care what you do with this. But the reality of the products is that the terms or the privacy policies are using data in that way.
Yes, yeah, sure.
So it just feels to me like, you talked about the value kind of from a sensible position, but do you think people just
Yeah.
actually, I want to use that. That's the cool new thing. I'm going
Yeah.
to go and use it.
Yeah, yeah. It's the convenience, isn't it? It's the convenience, and it's the fact that, as a society, everybody else is doing it as well. I think there's something in there, isn't there? And I think there's a big value, I think, that people see in kind of the connections that they get through those services and things. I think, you know, we again on the prep call, I think we talked about convenience trumping compliance, which I
Mm.
think is kind of, works perhaps from a sort of business perspective, but also from a consumer perspective as well. That, the convenience of being able to do that kind of trumps any sort of worries that they would have perhaps about what's going on with their data. I think the way that consent or pay has played out is quite interesting as a kind of example of this, because consent or pay, obviously, various organizations have introduced on their websites as a way of, still being able to target ads at people based on their data, to target
Yeah.
personalized ads at people, or the alternative being that you then pay a small fee to get a kind of an ad free or a non-personalized ad version.
Mm.
So the idea being that, businesses can kind of still preserve some of the revenue that they previously get from targeting ads at people. I was reading an article that I think said that somewhere between 0 and 1% of people have actually chosen to pay rather than rather than consent. And again, I think that's a really interesting indicator of this, because the fees are, I think most of the platforms set them around the sort of fiver mark, I think. Again, I've consented, so I don't I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
know
Same. Yeah.
firsthand. But, it's not a big figure, and, there's an element of there will be users who genuinely can't afford to pay that. But I suspect that the significant majority of people who are accessing these, it's not a monetary issue for that. It's not a financial consideration necessarily. They could pay it if they wanted to. But again, the convenience of not having to go through a process where you have to then put your card details in and pay for that, or use Google Pay or Apple Pay or whatever you're using to do that. And you just want to be able to click through and
Yeah.
get there and get that information that you want. And I think that just makes the concerns about the privacy side of it kind of fall away a bit.
Yeah, it's almost, I guess, as parallels. It's the same space, but talk of consent fatigue back in 2018, and
Mm,
all the privacy notices that were going out then, it almost is that thing now of actually people, I guess people are still fatigued. And when you see a consent or pay, it's like, well, is this any different to a cookie banner, or is this any different to other things I've seen? So
Yeah,
yeah, I wonder if that does factor in as well. But I really
definitely.
like, I'm not surprised at 99% people
No,
consenting if we've got two people who are privacy lawyers on the call who are both
yeah, it was still both.
consenting, right? So if we're not going to do it, like,
Yeah.
who is, sort of
Well,
thing. So
that's it. Yeah. And the kind of cookies banner, I think, is another really good parallel to it and a really good example. And, those have been around for ages, obviously. But, I anecdotally just speaking to people, friends, family, my husband particularly, the sort of really lengthy, extensive cookies banners that you see nowadays just really annoy him.
mm,
you know, and most people I speak to, their view is very much like, I don't really see that there's a massive negative impact to me from what is going on with the processing of my data in this context. And actually, that doesn't justify all of these really lengthy cookies banners that
yeah.
organizations sometimes feel they have to put in place. So again, yeah, I think this is a good example too.
Yeah, and it almost, I think, probably speaks to the need for good legal design and thinking more broadly than just, okay, well,
Mm,
we've got the text in there, we've got ourselves covered. Um, Actually making something that is usable and understandable for people, and ultimately doesn't, it gets them to engage rather than putting them all off and thinking, oh, GDPR is just that thing that is really annoying, or it's that kind of mentality, I think, that can cause damage to the space.
yeah, for sure.
I wonder if we flip now to the same question: is privacy already dead within businesses? What we have is a negatively framed, we have a position where data protection has effectively become a tick box exercise in larger businesses. If they have resources, they're being performative with their obligations, filling in forms, but they're not really changing how they process data or how they use individuals' data. So you've got that on the larger side. And then for smaller businesses which have got fewer resources, saying we'll deal with that later, or they'll just ignore it completely. So I guess with that as a kind of perhaps a one characterization, well, firstly, would you say that's an accurate portrayal? And also, do you think that there's a move for improvements in things like data protection by design and default, and better legal design as a whole? Big question for
Yeah,
you
I
there.
mean, again, yeah, it is a big question, and I think to come to the first bit, do I think it's an accurate characterization? I think to an extent, yes. I think that obviously, we see wildly differing approaches to privacy compliance across different organizations. And it's not necessarily always the case that size dictates how they do it. I find, for example, that a lot of the smaller businesses I work with are actually the ones who are most keen to get this right because consumer trust is so important to them, as it is for most businesses. I'm not saying that isn't the case for larger businesses too at all. But for a smaller business where they are just starting out and they've got to find a way to grow and to make their presence known and to get people to trust them, then actually I often find that they are the ones who are most keen to do things right and most privacy conscious in a lot of ways. And again, kind of, the other end of the scale, the larger businesses, again, there's a range of approaches. And I think that most of the, most large businesses, I suspect, do want to do this right. I think a really interesting sort of shift that seems to be happening at the moment, both among the kind of clients I'm talking to, but on a wider regulatory level, actually, is a real drive towards simplification. I think when GDPR first came into effect fully in 2018, there was obviously, that people put in place these like super, super robust processes. There was a big kind of cultural shift at a lot of organizations, where they quite successfully kind of built that into their culture. And I think as digital regulation has continued to evolve since then, and there now are tons of different digital type regulations and legislation and all of this. Somebody referred to it at a conference I was at the other week as an alphabet soup of digital regulation, which I think is quite accurate.
Yeah,
You've got the
nice. Yeah,
the DMA, which Digital Markets Act, DSA, Digital Services Act, DMCC, Digital Markets Consumer and Competition. Like that, you've got all these different acronyms, all these different acts that are all sort of have all these kind of interweaving requirements. And when I'm speaking to clients, a lot of what I'm hearing at the moment is actually people, particularly on the sort of business side of things, are getting quite, or can get quite, frustrated with all of these different things that they have to comply with. We see it a lot when we're talking to clients about AI risk assessments, right? And they have these very thorough, robust AI risk assessments for all the AI use cases that they have to get approved. But then they also, alongside that, they have to do a DPIA, and then they also have to do a supplier impact assessment, and they also have to do perhaps a fundamental rights impact assessment. And it's almost sort of like death by assessment.
Yeah.
And I think we've now seen, just in the last couple of weeks, the European Commission has released these digital omnibus reform proposals, which touch on a bunch of different digital regulations. But again, a lot of those proposals really are about simplification, and even things like proposing a sort of one-stop shop for incident notification, where you don't have to notify if you have an incident or a personal data breach. You don't have to notify it to several different regulators or in several different places. You just have one streamlined thing. And I think what that speaks to is that there is an appreciation of the fact that this has become a little bit this has all grown legs, all of this regulation. It's become a little bit kind of almost too burdensome. And I think that is almost sometimes counterproductive to compliance, because actually people then just get fed up of it, and people think, well, why do I have to go through all these steps when actually I just want to innovate and I want to do it in a responsible way,
Yeah.
but I want to do it in a realistic way. And I think some of the sort of simplifications that have been proposed do sort of, to me, speak to an appreciation of that.
Mm. And I think there's almost that well, we could take this in two directions. One is the kind of geopolitical side of like perhaps the US versus Europe approach to regulation. But what I think thing that was in my head then was just around, you mentioned the death by assessment and thing like that. I I almost think like when GDPR first came in, there weren't really privacy lawyers in-house, but now we see that quite a lot. And much quicker, it seems that there are now AI governance teams or AI teams within businesses. And I wonder, do you see the teams within businesses changing? And will there just be a privacy team now? Will it be privacy AI? Will it be dealing with all the alphabet soup? Will people have to be multidisciplinary? What do you think there?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure I have a kind of an answer to it necessarily. I think we see, again, we see very different approaches, which is never very helpful as an answer to a question. Particularly the typical lawyer answer, it depends. But
Hmm.
we do see people dealing with this in a different way, and I certainly think it is true that the role of privacy teams within organizations is evolving and will continue to evolve. So we already see different structures, and some organizations will have specific, data protection or privacy teams. Some will have it as part of a wider compliance team. Some will drive it mostly out of legal rather than necessarily having a sort of, separate data protection function or privacy function, or whatever. So there are lots of different approaches that we kind of already see. You used a word in there which I use a lot when I'm talking about AI, particularly, which is multidisciplinary. And I think that's the really important thing to bear in mind with all of this, particularly on the AI side, is it requires a very multidisciplinary approach. We have talked a lot with clients and also at sort of events that we've run about this sort of perennial question that I don't think anybody has necessarily nailed yet, of who owns AI within an
Yeah.
organization, and where that ownership should and whilst that, again, the sort of ownership question varies, I think one of the things that is very clear and does come through in a lot of the conversations we have is that the right people need to be in the room. The right people need to be involved in those discussions. And we've seen lots of clients setting up, working groups or kind of forums to assess use cases, with a view that actually there's not just one specialism and one skill set that can look at everything, every risk that AI presents, and take a view on it. It's very difficult for one lawyer to cover all of those risks at once.
Yeah.
And so then when you factor in that, okay, well, it's not just law, it's, the ethics team, and there's also, security impact as well that needs to be thought about. I think privacy often land with ownership of AI in organizations. And I'm not actually sure that that is always necessarily the right approach, because privacy is just one part of it.
Yeah.
I think we've seen an increasing move towards having a kind of responsible AI officer or responsible AI team, which is where the kind of that acts as sort of the central hub. And then you have the spokes of all the different specialisms that you need to get involved.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on the organization whether that's a formal structure and a formal team or it's like you
Mm,
say a working group or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's interesting again just coming back to the point around the number of different regulations that are starting to apply and
Mm,
the number of different assessments, the number of different compliance programs that people have to build. And it's almost like there's now such a broad spread that cer- the if it is a privacy team that has been landed with it and they're now the privacy and AI team, their workload is effectively doubled overnight. For what
yep,
you've got two areas rather than one,
yep,
and it almost there is this concern in my mind that, and I think you raised it as well about if you start to spread yourselves too thinly because of all these compliance obligations, the actual improvements and benefits and the reasons why these laws were brought in that they don't ever happen because because the teams are so thinly spread.
yeah. Yeah, that is very true, but it also kind of it can also stop innovation or hinder innovation actually, because I think that you then just don't have it. It slows things down, right? You if teams are too thinly spread, if they don't have the resource and the skill sets and the immediate kind of knowledge to pick up on all these risks and deal with all these questions, then you end up in a position where perhaps,
Yeah.
there is just almost too much risk aversion around it. And you end up actually, there's again this age old question, isn't there, of, whether kind of governance and regulation stifles innovation or facilitates innovation. But what I do know is that the clients that I see who are doing the most with AI are the ones that have the really robust frameworks around it, because actually then people know the parameters that they can work within and they've got the right skill sets so that when something does need to go for approval, it can get through that process really quickly. They've kind of put a lot of thought into, how they manage that process. So, I think if it's done right, then actually having those more robust structures around it actually helps innovation as well. It's not just helping compliance, it's actually helping to facilitate the innovation.
So it's almost like a self-serve scenario for, does my use of this technology fit within these parameters? If that's okay, great, I can proceed rather than having to get everything reviewed. Yeah, and it just,
Yeah.
in my day job now, thinking more about automated flows and approvals and
Mm,
very much in a contract context of, does it tick these five criteria? If so, I'll review it. If it doesn't tick all five of them or it's under $10,000, we're not gonna look
yeah,
at it. And
yeah,
it feels like that the only way teams will be able to cope is to actually sift through those use cases or those new vendors or whatever it might be and say, this doesn't meet the criteria for us to review it. We won't review it on it. There has to be a risk-based approach there. Uh, I
yeah,
guess
for
the
sure.
the resource question is if you do end up being so thinly spread that you have to bring in extra people or something, you then say, okay, well, we've got the head count, but 50% of the organization now is compliance, or for a startup, you're not going to be
Yeah,
able to do that. So
yeah,
there's
yeah,
clearly a
yeah.
tension there. Is
There is, yeah, 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 for sure. I completely agree. There's definitely a tension there, and I think it is really interesting. I talked earlier about kind of the moves towards simplification at an EU level or at a sort of
Yeah.
regulatory level, but that is happening at an organisational level too. And I think again, we're one of the things we're doing a lot with clients at the moment is looking actually not just in the AI context, but more widely at other risk assessment processes like DPIAs. Again, I
Mm.
think the same issues are often experienced there, where there are things going through these assessments that actually are super low risk and don't really need to. And I think that kind of
Yeah.
came out of a real sort of risk aversion when the GDPR first came into effect. And that's just kind of
Yeah.
stayed at that kind of level. And the same with AI, it was all when it was all kind of kicking off a couple of years ago and everyone was like, oh God, we've got all these Gen AI use cases that we now need to get our heads around. They put these really robust frameworks in place, which are brilliant, but not every use case is going to warrant having that really detailed, really thorough risk assessment. And so lots of our clients have more recently been looking at how they can streamline that kind of upfront bit of, looking at doing some screening, does it meet these criteria? And if so, we can just wave it through. There are perhaps some standard mitigations, standard conditions that you put around that perhaps, but otherwise it just helps to make sure that you're giving the attention to the ones that really need it. But
Yeah.
and just quickly on the resource point as well, I think one of the big challenges with resource is that, you have these processes in place and everybody is so busy doing things how they are done that nobody has time to then put the work in to
I
then
know that
streamline.
pain.
It's the I bet you do. I bet you do. It's such a paradox, isn't it? Because, that by putting that upfront work in, you will simplify the process and you will streamline it and make it so much easier for everybody going forward. But it's finding the time to
Yeah.
actually put in upfront to do that, which is a challenge as well.
And I think for in-house teams, the real challenge is like how to structure them. And I there's definitely going to be an
Yeah.
episode on that,
Yeah.
because I think certainly for privacy teams and privacy data teams, data AI, whatever your team's called these days, I think there's this real kind of there's if you are made up of lawyers in a lot of cases still think in-house we need to operate like a private practice lawyer. But actually, the more I think about it, certainly for privacy teams, if you're in a SaaS business or you're in a high consumer business where you're getting a lot of questions from consumers, it really feels like you have to start thinking, go to a customer service team, how do they do it, and emulate that. And then instead of the knowledge or the subject matter expertise being dealing with customer complaints or making customers happy, it's privacy law, data protection. Like, that to me just feels that there's almost like I'm seeing this switch a bit with teams where they're bringing in more legal ops people, privacy ops, bringing in analysts for dealing with the assessments. And seeing it, you probably see it more than I do, but it's a journey that's going on there, I think.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, 100%. And I think that as businesses are looking to kind of scale their innovation in these kind of areas, actually I completely agree, what they're looking for from their lawyers, whether in-house or private practice, it shifts. And I think actually we certainly feel nowadays that we are looked at much more as a kind of commercial partner necessarily than an external lawyer or an external law
Yeah.
firm.
Well, the final area I wanted to turn to, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, and I really wanted to touch on agentic AI and emerging tech
Yes.
and how privacy fits in with that. And it's something that I'm definitely not really sure on. So I would appreciate some of your insight, and I feel like there might be another "it depends" kind of answer coming on this one as well. But so with agentic AI, what are your thoughts
Mm.
on the kind of what the key privacy and compliance challenges are there? So for anyone listening, we might not have any listeners to this first episode, we'll see. But
My mum will listen. I can
okay,
guarantee
cool.
you
I
that.
think
There you go. You've got
I'll have
one
my
listener. Shout out to my mum.
excellent. Yeah, I hopefully have a few kind family and friends who might listen as well. For anyone listening, the issue, of course, is that with agentic AI, you are giving that the authority to act on your behalf, process your data, make decisions with your data, give your data out to different people, different organizations to do things with. And yeah, I'm interested to get your view on what you perceive as the key privacy and compliance challenges in the face of the development of agentic AI.
Yeah, sure. So, agentic AI is really interesting. I feel like I've used the word interesting way too much in this podcast. It's because everything genuinely is very interesting to me. Yeah, agentic AI is something we're talking about it a lot. We're thinking about it a lot, and there are almost two ways that you can think about agentic AI. There's kind of, because I think what you had touched on before, Ben, was this sort of agentic AI in the sort of wider ecosystem sense of things like agentic commerce. So, for example, OpenAI has now released this agentic commerce protocol where, as you say, you can have an AI agent that acts on your behalf as a consumer, as a user. You can instruct it to go and buy you a cushion that meets certain requirements, and it will go off and do that itself. Yeah, so you set those initial parameters, but then it works out itself how to do that and executes it for you. But then we also see agentic AI in a more sort of in-house, in inverted commas, context where, an organization could be using an agentic AI workflow to manage consumer complaints or something, for example. So you as the consumer, you call up the customer service line or you talk to the customer service chatbot or whatever, but it's not an agent kind of necessarily acting on your behalf. It's a sort of separate workflow. So I think it is kind of worth just drawing out that distinction, because I think the considerations are similar, but possibly play out in slightly different ways for each of those elements. And I think in terms of key privacy and compliance challenges, I mean, kind of where to start in a lot of ways. The one thing I would say up front, which again comes out of a lot of the conversations I have with clients, agentic AI isn't a type of, or a building on generative AI. It's not like a new type of technology necessarily. And I think we always need to have in our minds the starting point that the GDPR and indeed all the legislation that we are looking at around this, broadly speaking, EU AI Act aside, is technology neutral, right? So GDPR doesn't care that you're using AI or agentic AI to process personal data. It cares that you comply with those principles. But I do think that there are certain of those principles that are more challenging perhaps in an AI context than in other contexts, and then again more challenging in an agentic AI context than in a traditional generative AI context. Isn't it mad that we're talking about traditional generative AI? It's wild, but that's how fast these things move. So I think, a few things that immediately come to mind on it are sort of transparency as a kind of obvious one that again I think has always been a challenge with AI, because you have, from a GDPR perspective and under other legislation as well, as an organization you have obligations to be transparent for individuals about how you're using their data, where systems are being used to make automated decisions about people without human oversight. You have to be able to explain those decisions in a way that's meaningful for those people. That, as I say, difficult in AI generally, because there's this sort of black box problem that again people have talked about for years of you don't necessarily know, as the data controller, as the consumer facing organization, you don't necessarily know what's going on inside that black box. You don't necessarily know what the algorithm is doing or how it's making those decisions. And vendors are often quite kind of protective of that as being their kind of IP and their trade secrets and stuff. And that kind of again is then amplified in agentic AI, where you have these kind of multi-agent models where there are different agents talking to each other. And again, all you've done at the start really is set the parameters, and then it's the agent that has decided then how to go and fulfill those tasks. So how you then start to explain that, how you start to understand it yourself as an organization, and how you then start to explain it to individuals in a way that they can understand, I think is very difficult.
Yeah, again, coming back to the point where people are choosing tools and choosing services that they just ultimately want to
Mm,
use, do you think that
mm,
there has to just be some level of trust, or it kind of leaving aside all the legal stuff? It's just people are going to
yeah.
have to trust these tools. And I guess it's then incumbent on businesses to be building things that people trust. Or if you were being a cynic about it, you might say that people will use the tools anyway, regardless of the trust, because they're just really good tools that enable you to do what you want to
Yeah.
do very well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think and that probably gets you so far, doesn't it? And it's then when something goes wrong that's when you sort of lose the trust. So I think that the trust, there's kind of the upfront trust, but there's also the risk of like losing the trust, which
Yeah.
almost perhaps is the greater risk in some respects. And yeah, it comes back around to the discussions we were having right at the start, doesn't it? Around, will people use these things anyway? I think perhaps yes, but I do think that people are going to have a certain level of trust, and I think that just thinking through the transparency piece a bit more, what I always find interesting about transparency is it can, and I think probably with all areas of data protection and compliance, it can be very easy to get very caught up in the exact wording of the legislation and think like, oh, these are things, and feel like you have to go about explaining these things in either a very legalistic or a very technical way.
Yeah.
But actually, I always think what's really helpful in these situations is to sort of step back and put yourself in those shoes of the person who has then got to interact with this thing and say, well, what would I need to know to feel comfortable using this and to understand the implications of it? And actually, that sometimes means actually you can be a bit more high level about your explanation. You don't need to go into huge amounts of detail as to how the algorithm works and all this. And a lot
Yeah.
of this comes out in the regulatory guidance as well. That's not necessarily the expectation, to be really detailed. It has to be meaningful. And I think that word meaningful is really important. It has to enable people to understand enough so that they can exercise a genuine choice as to whether they use that or not. And that is an informed choice. So, sort of sometimes just taking that step back and thinking about it from your own perspective, I think can just help put a bit more of a kind of pragmatic lens on it.
Yeah. And I think one of the themes flowing throughout what we've been talking about is, whether it's the cookie banners or whether it's legal design or anything, is actually ultimately transparency is done far better where the language is simple. Your
Yeah,
average person,
definitely.
your average person isn't going to worry about which LLMs are being used to generate something for them. They're more interested perhaps that an LLM is being used and that their data is safe, perhaps, or it's not necessarily the technical information, like you say, it's the simple, plain language explanations that people
Yeah.
want.
Yeah. And I think it's really easy to forget that that itself is baked into the legislation as well. Like the GDPR requires you to provide certain information to people about how their data is processed, but it requires you to do it in a way that's concise and uses clear and plain language. And I think some of the privacy notices that we see nowadays are pages and pages long. And perhaps some of the actual, important information for people can get a bit lost in
Yeah,
all of that sometimes.
yeah. I mean,
So that is helpful to come back
yeah,
to that.
yeah. The famous thing of privacy notices, no one reads them until something goes wrong, and then they're really important. Like yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a real issue there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
agreed. And just another sort of point on agentic AI that's come out a lot in the discussions I've been having is this sort of human oversight piece. The human oversight requirements come out in a number of different areas, but particularly from a GDPR perspective, if you are making wholly automated decisions with significant effects, then you have to allow for human oversight in that process if people want it.
yeah,
Have to allow the decision to be remade by human essentially. But there are also, from an EU AI Act perspective, specific requirements on providers and deployers around the sort of human oversight requirements. Providers have to build high risk AI systems in such a way that they can facilitate human oversight, and deployers have to ensure that there is sufficient human oversight. And again, how that plays out in an agentic context is really interesting and really tricky because by its nature, it's a more autonomous process, and it has agency. That's where agentic comes from, is it has agency, you know, either to act on behalf of you as a consumer or to go make decisions on behalf of an organization. So I don't think there is clarity at the moment really on sort of what the regulatory expectations are going to be on the extent to which you need to build human oversight into that process and how, just practically speaking, you do that. So that's kind of I don't have any sort of solution to that necessarily, but just to
yeah.
throw that out as another sort of key challenge that's coming through in the discussions I'm having.
And how are you seeing your clients deal with that kind of a situation?
So, well, so one of the things that's been really interesting that's come out from I've been involved in some of the kind of wider industry discussions on the financial services side of this, and there is a bit of a sort of distinction, I suppose, between there are some organizations who feel that actually they kind of can't really do much about this until they get some regulatory guidance. So they're kind of almost stalling a little bit and being a bit kind of risk averse and a bit cautious about it until there seems to be a sort of clearer regulatory position on some of these issues. But then I think probably the majority are actually saying, well, actually, what we want is we want to kind of be able to feel our own way here and work this out for ourselves and almost just kind of go ahead and do it and then work out how we address that as and when we need to get there, right? And sort of, feel like actually it's the industry who needs to be responsible for sort of setting what those best practices will look like before the regulators kind of step in and try and put their own sort of spin on it. So, that those organizations that I am seeing kind of innovate in the agentic context are kind of treating it as in fact I'm not sure I've come across trying to think if I've come across one in practice yet that actually falls into EU AI Act high risk. I'm not sure I have in terms of the advice that I've been doing, which kind of that's where a lot of the human oversight piece comes from a GDPR perspective. It's very much about, could the decision be made by a human if it needed, if somebody challenged it. And so that's a little bit easier to sort of get round. And actually, certainly from UK GDPR perspective, the wholly automated decision making requirements have been a bit relaxed with the Data Use and Access Act anyway. So there's a little bit kind of there's a little bit more relaxation around that, I think. And I think that's sort of made people feel a bit freer to innovate in this space and to kind of experiment. And I suppose that's it. A lot of the stuff I'm seeing at the moment is kind of experimentation in all of this, in, very sort of closed environments, in very low risk scenarios where people are just sort of experimenting with that technology. So I'm not sure it's really an answer to the question, but it's just, it's been interesting to sort of be involved in some of those discussions around kind of where different organizations see the roles of the regulators in all of this as
Yeah.
well, in helping organizations to innovate.
Yeah, I think what you're saying there about the businesses looking kind of to create industry standards or self-regulate, that to me feels like a positive step. But then if you compare it to other industries where there are industry bodies, the one that comes to head is like online advertising with the IAB.
Mm,
There's been obviously lots of legal challenges with that throughout from regulators. I wonder that is a similarly complex environment, and my knowledge is pretty out of date on that area. But like, it almost feels like where there are business or where there are groups of businesses or industry groups or something in that space, there's still always going to be challenges. So it feels like the way to, well, almost like perhaps the way that the end point will be that a regulator
mm,
may step in anyway.
yeah. Yeah, that's it. And I think, and a lot of it for my sort of personal view on it, I suppose, is that um it probably is an area where there needs some kind of regulatory coordination, but there are things that are really important in building that any sort of regulatory guidance, regulatory intervention. I think always needs to be bottom up rather than top down, and needs to be created with it, like in conjunction with industry. And I think part of that is always going to necessitate a bit of an appreciation of the fact that, businesses are not just going to stall and not, I mean, to say some are, but as a whole, industry is not just going to stall and not do anything with this
Yeah,
technology. And so actually, if we are at a point where there isn't a lot of regulatory clarity, and that might come, I say, with discussion from industry, which is the way I think it should be done, during that period, I think there does need to be a regulatory appreciation that, you know, people are going to do this, and they will do their best, and they will do
mm,
this in a responsible way. And there might be circumstances where it doesn't necessarily meet the letter of the law, but actually, in terms of the spirit of the law and what the law is designed to protect, I think there are almost kind of common sense ways that people can be, starting to address some of these challenges. Where if they then document that and record that that's why they've taken that approach, actually, I think they need to be able to do that in some comfort. That then the regulator is not going to come and say, "Well, you didn't allow for human oversight of this specific bit here, and therefore we're going to fine you." And I think just generally, a sort of sense of pragmatism and realism from the regulators can kind of go a long way in all of this. Regulators kind of understanding the technology and the sort of the some of the what might be perceived as kind of limitations of what how far you can go in some of those areas of compliance with this type of technology. I suppose what I'm saying is it's not necessarily saying that we don't need to regulate around this and we don't need the regulatory guidance and frameworks, but it just needs to be done in the right way
yeah.
that really does actually enable innovation as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about you don't want people to act in good faith and then later be punished for making a certain decision based on where there's not a set position or a guidance on
Yeah.
something. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's it.
I absolutely think the pragmatist approach is the right way to go, and like trying to do the best thing you can
Yeah.
as the position emerges, which I think actually is probably the experience of most lawyers in their career is let's just have a go at doing the best we can
Yeah.
do given the resources and the information we have available.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Cool. Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation. I think probably we can draw it to a close there. We've covered a lot of ground in this
We
one.
have.
So yeah, just want to say a big thank you to you, Emma, and thank you for coming along, and thank you
Oh, you're
to
very
your
welcome.
mum for listening in as well in advance.
She'll get a second shout out. She'll love it. She'll love it.
And I'm sure my mum and dad are listening as well.
Yeah.
It's been lovely to talk, and I'm
Yeah,
sure we'll speak again
likewise.
soon.
Will do. Thanks so much for having me on, Ben. I've really enjoyed it.
Cool. Thank you.